Armored warfare in the desert. The Second World War was fought not only in the fields of Europe or on the Pacific Islands, but also in the vast and arid deserts of North Africa. Between 1940 and 1943, the dunes, oases, and desert plains became battlegrounds where mobility and logistics determined the success or failure of the opposing forces. Armored warfare in this theater of operations was an unprecedented challenge, where distances, lack of resources, and harsh climatic conditions tested the endurance and adaptability of the armies involved. North Africa, bordering the Mediterranean Sea, became a vitally important front because its access routes cut into the supply routes for oil from the Middle East and resources from the colonies. Control of this region meant dominating maritime and land traffic between Europe, Asia, and Africa, which led the British and Axis forces to fight a series of military operations that redefined the concept of mobile desert warfare. The start of operations in North Africa was marked by the confrontation between the Kingdom of Italy and the United Kingdom. Italy, an ally of Nazi Germany, had expanded its presence in Africa with the colony of Libya, while the British controlled Egypt and the strategic Suez Canal. As the war progressed in Europe, Mussolini, eager to expand his empire and achieve a victory that would demonstrate Italy's military strength, decided to launch an offensive against the British forces in Egypt, Operazione E. Welcome to the Soldier's Diary. Operazione E, the Italian attempt to conquer Egypt. Benito Mussolini sought, through the possession of colonies such as Libya and Ethiopia, to restore the glory of the Roman Empire and consolidate a new Italian empire under fascist ideology. The conquest of Ethiopia, achieved in 1936 after decades of tension, had a strong symbolic component: to avenge Italy's humiliating defeat at Adwa, 1896, and position Italy as a colonial power comparable to France and the United Kingdom. This expansion also responded to the idea of Mare Nostrum, Italian dominion over the Mediterranean, in the style of the ancient Roman Empire. From a practical point of view, Mussolini believed that colonies could be a solution to internal demographic pressure, serving as a destination for Italian settlers and a source of strategic raw materials. Although many of these colonies were economically deficient, agricultural and industrial infrastructure projects were promoted, especially in Libya, with the intention of exploiting their resources and establishing protected markets for Italian products. This approach also included the idea of living space, spazio vitale, a concept similar to the Nazi Lebensraum, which proposed the need for territorial expansion for the growth of the nation. Furthermore, African colonies held key strategic and propaganda value. Libya offered an important military base for controlling the southern flank of the Mediterranean, and Ethiopia, despite its complex geography and limited infrastructure, was used as a symbol of fascist military power. The regime's propaganda exalted the figure of the Duce as an imperial leader, presenting the creation of the empire as a national triumph, even when the invasion provoked international sanctions. Thus, Mussolini's colonialism combined geopolitical, economic, and symbolic ambitions with the aim of consolidating Italy's prestige on the world stage. Thus, by consolidating the Italian presence in Libya and Ethiopia, Mussolini had not only succeeded in fulfilling a central part of his imperial vision, but had also laid the groundwork for future military campaigns that would test the solidity of the fascist empire. With the colonies now converted into platforms for the projection of Italian power, the regime decided to go on the offensive. On September 13, 1940, from the sands of the Libyan desert, an operation would be launched that would mark the beginning of Italy's active participation in the African theater of World War II, Operazione E. On September 13, 1940, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, Commander-in-Chief of the Italian forces in Libya, began Operazione E with the goal of advancing from Cyrenaica toward Egypt and expelling the British from the region. Mussolini had ordered the offensive expecting a quick victory, but conditions on the ground were very different from what the Italian dictator had imagined. Despite having approximately 150,000 men, 1,500 artillery pieces, and hundreds of armored vehicles, the Italian army was ill-prepared for desert warfare. The Italian advance began from positions in Libya, crossing the border into Egypt with a series of mechanized and motorized units. However, logistical difficulties and a lack of adequate training in mobile warfare made the advance slow and ineffective. Instead of a swift and decisive assault, the Italian forces moved haltingly, establishing defensive outposts along their route of advance. By September 16th, they had reached the town of Sidi, just 95 kilometers from the Libyan border, where they set up fortified camps awaiting reinforcements and supplies. One of the biggest problems facing Italian troops was the shortage of fuel and water, essential elements in the desert. Furthermore, the Italian strategy was based on static warfare tactics more appropriate for Europe than for the dynamic desert environment. In terms of equipment, the Italian army deployed a variety of armored vehicles that, while substantial in number, lacked the capacity to effectively engage British tanks. The Italian army's armored units presented significant limitations in terms of design, armament, and protection. Prominent among these were the Carro Veloci L3/33 and L3/35, derived from the British Carden-Loyd Mark VI tankettes, designed for reconnaissance and support. The L3/33, introduced in 1933, was armed with a single 6.5mm Fiat Revelli model 1914 machine gun, while the L3/35, introduced in 1935, was armed with a single 8mm Breda Model 30 machine gun, 1935, incorporated two 8mm Breda M38 machine guns, and improvements in armor assembly. Despite their mobility and compact design, their weak armor and light armament made them vulnerable even to infantry equipped with basic anti-tank weapons. On the other hand, the Carro Armato M1139 was an attempt to create a more capable medium tank, but its design suffered from serious flaws. Its 37mm Vickers Turney gun was mounted on the hull rather than in a turret, limiting its ability to engage moving targets. Its armor, composed of riveted steel plates up to 30mm thick, proved insufficient against British anti-tank weapons. Despite a 105-horsepower Fiat Espoir 8T diesel engine, which gave it moderate mobility, the overall design presented significant vulnerabilities in combat. The evolution of the M11/39 led to the Carro Armato M13/40, which incorporated improvements based on lessons learned in combat. It mounted a 47mm Cannonade de 47-32 cannon in a two-man turret, allowing greater flexibility in combat, as well as 3 or 4 8mm Breda 38 machine guns. Its armor, up to 42mm on the turret mantlet and 30mm on the hull front, although improved, remained vulnerable due to the low quality of the steel and the use of rivets. In terms of mobility, it had a 125-horsepower diesel engine that gave it adequate speeds for the desert, although the lack of efficient air filters led to mechanical problems due to sand and dust. Despite these improvements, the M13/40 lagged behind modern Allied tanks due to its limited armament and insufficient protection, which highlighted the structural deficiencies of Italian armored design during World War II. Operation Compass, the British counterattack. The British response was swift after the Italian border incursion. Aware of the weakness of Rome's positions, the British launched Operation Compass on the 9th of December 1940, a lightning offensive led by General Richard O'Connor. Despite having a much smaller force of around 36,000 troops, 275 Matilda tanks, and heavy support from the Royal Air Force, RAF, the British strategy was based on mobility, stealth, and surprise. The British armoured armament deployed during Operation Compass proved superior in terms of mobility, firepower, and protection. One of the most iconic tanks of the desert conflict, the Matilda II possessed exceptional armour of up to 78mm, 3.1 inches, across its frontal section, rendering it virtually immune to the 47mm, 1.7-inch guns of the Italian M1340s. Although its main armament, a QF 2-pounder 40mm gun, had limited anti-tank capability against heavier armour, its combination of protection and accuracy made it a formidable opponent. However, its top speed of 26 km per hour, 16 miles per hour, limited its ability to maneuver quickly in open country. Despite these limitations, the Matilda II remained a very effective infantry tank in this early stage of the conflict. In contrast, the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that formed the core of the Afrika Korps displayed a different approach. Although initially lighter armoured, their mobility and speed were superior, allowing for more flexible operations. Over time, the Panzers would be upgraded with larger caliber guns to compensate for their inferior armour compared to British tanks. On the other hand, the cruiser, the Mark IV, represented the other side of British armoured warfare doctrine, favouring mobility over protection. Equipped with the same QF 2-pounder gun, this tank possessed a significantly higher speed, reaching 40 km per hour, 25 miles per hour, in open terrain. Its armour, between 14 and 30 millimeters, 0.5 to 1.2 inches, was lighter than that of the Matilda II, but its speed and manoeuvrability allowed it to exploit the enemy's tactical weaknesses. Together, the combination of heavily armoured infantry tanks and agile cruiser tanks gave British forces a decisive advantage in the desert campaign, allowing them to carry out rapid encircling attacks that devastated the poorly coordinated and under-equipped Italian armoured units. The British took advantage of the dispersion of Italian forces to launch coordinated attacks against key positions. In the early hours of December 9th, units of the 4th Indian Division and the 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, attacked Sidi in a masterstroke of speed and precision. Italian resistance quickly crumbled, and in just 3 days the British achieved a decisive victory, capturing more than 38,000 prisoners and large quantities of equipment. Far from stopping, British forces continued their advance into Cyrenaica, taking advantage of the enemy's disorderly retreat. The Italians attempted to reorganize at Bardia and Tobruk, but were unable to halt the British thrust. By February 1941, the British had taken Benghazi and virtually eliminated the entire Italian presence in the region. In total, Operation Compass resulted in the capture of 130,000 Italian troops and the destruction of much of the Italian 10th Army, forcing Mussolini to urgently request help from Hitler. The Germans arrived. Far from stopping, British forces continued their advance into Cyrenaica, taking advantage of the enemy's disorderly retreat. The Italians attempted to reorganize at Bardia and Tobruk, but were unable to halt the British thrust. By February 1941, the British had taken Benghazi and virtually eliminated the entire Italian presence in the region. In total, Operation Compass resulted in the capture of 130,000 Italian troops and the destruction of much of the Italian 10th Army, forcing Mussolini to urgently request help from Hitler. The catastrophic Italian defeat in North Africa exposed the serious deficiencies of Mussolini's army, prompting the German High Command to intervene to prevent a total collapse. Hitler, although initially reluctant to divert resources to the Mediterranean, eventually agreed to Mussolini's request and ordered the dispatch of an expeditionary force to stabilize the situation. The choice of a suitable commander fell on Irvin Raml, a charismatic and daring general who had distinguished himself in the 1940 French campaign. Rommel, with his aggressive style and battlefield leadership skills, was seen as the best option to revitalize the Axis effort in the desert. When Rommel arrived in Africa, he brought with him a fully developed art of warfare. He had won a Pour le Mérite, the famous Blue Max, for a series of daring exploits in the 1917 Caporetto campaign. He had been a hugely popular tactical instructor at the Dresden Infantry School between the wars, and he had commanded one of the army's prized panzer divisions, the 7th, during the 1940 campaign in the West. In France, Rommel behaved more like an 18th-century hussar on a raiding mission than a divisional commander. He led from the front, braved enemy fire on numerous occasions, and occasionally switched off his radio to avoid receiving orders to hold back. He advanced so rapidly that the 7th Panzer earned the nickname Ghost Division for its tendency to disappear from situation maps and reappear where least expected. There were many in the German High Command, including Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder, who did not greatly appreciate Rommel running amok, but as one analyst put it, it was impossible to court-martial such a successful general, so Rommel was awarded the Ritterkreuz instead. In Africa, it would be the same. Rommel arrived in February 1941 with rather mundane orders to act as a spur band, a blockader to reinforce the Italians after their disastrous defeat at Beda. FOM. The force he led was appropriately small. The reconnaissance battalion and an anti-tank detachment of the 5th Light Division, soon renamed the 21st Panzer Division. The rest of the division was still on its way to Africa, and a 2nd Division, the 15th Panzer, it would not arrive fully until the end of May. Rommel had his orders, but he had disobeyed orders in the past and had been decorated for it. With British forces weakened by their ill-conceived campaign in Greece, he carried out a quick personal reconnaissance in his trusty Fiesler aircraft. Storch then launched an offensive in conjunction with his Italian allies, the Ariete Panzer Division and the infantry divisions of X-Corps, Bologna and Pavia. He penetrated the British defences at El Agheila on 24 March, then advanced to Mersa el Brega on 31 March, pausing only long enough to receive and ignore a series of radio messages from Berlin and Rome warning him against rash action. Finally, he crushed the British defenders at Agdabia, elements of the inexperienced 2nd Armoured Division, equipped in part with captured Italian M1340 tanks, pinning them down with the infantry of the 5th Light Division while sending his panzers on an enveloping movement up the southern flank of the desert, the first use of a tactic that was to become his personal signature. These small fights, none of them more than regimental strength, were enough to destabilize the entire British defensive position in Cyrenaica. Rommel rapidly expanded his reconnaissance in force into a general offensive, despite his scant resources. One column advanced along the coastal road towards Benghazi, while 2 others crossed the Cyrenaic salient, capturing a large amount of British supplies at Msus and Mekili. The British rear was thrown into chaos. On the 6th of April, a German motorcycle patrol captured the British commander in Cyrenaica, General Philip Neame, as well as General Richard O'Connor, the victor at Bede. By the 11th of April, the Germans had surrounded the coastal fortress of Tobruk, while small units advanced eastwards, taking Bardia and reaching the Egyptian frontier at Sollum and Fort Capuzzo. This advance was at an impressive speed, with the Afrika Korps covering over 600 miles in less than 2 weeks, an astonishing achievement to be sure, but Rommel had advanced from central Libya to the Egyptian border in a single leap. He now had an unconquered fortress in his rear, a serious threat to his lines of communication and supply. 2 hasty attempts to assault Tobruk ended in failure. In the Easter battle fought between the 10th and 14th of April and the Battle of the Salient, between the 30th of April and the 4th of May, the defenders of the 9th Australian Division held out stoutly. Minefields funneled German attacks, while direct fire from artillery, anti-tank guns and supporting tanks inflicted heavy casualties on the assault forces and resulted in the death of General Heinrich von Prittwitz, commander of the 15th Panzer Division. The mere presence of Tobruk unconquered rendered the advance across the desert pointless. Indeed, despite the fame it had given him in the world press, this first campaign did not win him many friends in the Berlin High Command. General Halder, in particular, was unimpressed. "Rommel runs around all day long with his formations scattered everywhere," he wrote. "He seems to have gone mad." His criticism had some foundation. A German division had occupied vast territories, but had not actually achieved any decisive victories. There was no battle of annihilation or Kesselschlacht, nor could there be. The Afrika. The Corps had come a long way, but was now in a precarious position. Although Rommel and his troops displayed an admirable level of aggression, something respected by all officers, many considered their advance to the Egyptian border to have been a strategic error. Rommel's forces. The central problem of Africa. The Corps' weakness at this point was not a lack of fighting will, but rather logistics. As Rommel advanced further east, his supply lines became dangerously stretched. Most of his supplies came from Tripoli, a port more than 1,500 kilometers from the Egyptian border. Libya's poorly developed infrastructure offered neither roads nor railways adequate to sustain a prolonged offensive. Furthermore, the British Royal Navy and Allied air forces constantly harassed Italian convoys carrying reinforcements and supplies from Italy, drastically reducing the amount of material reaching African hands. Corps. The situation became even more difficult with the consolidation of Tobruk as an Allied stronghold. The city, well defended by Australian and British troops, represented a serious strategic problem. Not only did it serve as a constant threat to Axis lines of communication, but it was also used as a supply base and assembly point for British forces planning a counter-offensive. Rommel understood that as long as Tobruk remained in enemy hands, his position on the Egyptian border would be untenable. Despite the difficulties, Rommel decided to maintain pressure on the British. He knew that although his own army was poorly supplied, the enemy's situation was not ideal either. The Western Desert Force, now renamed the British Eighth Army, had suffered heavy losses in Greece and Crete, leaving it temporarily weakened. However, the arrival of reinforcements, including new Matilda and Crusader tanks, would soon begin to even the balance. Thus, with the summer of 1941 approaching, the North African theatre of operations was at a turning point. To sustain the offensive and counter the growing Allied resistance, Rommel relied on the mobility and shock power of his armoured force. The Deutsches Afrika Korps, DK, deployed a variety of tanks adapted to desert warfare. Among the main models used were the Panzer I, Panzer II, Panzer III, and Panzer IV. The Panzer Brunn, originally designed as a training vehicle, was armed only with machine guns and had light armor, making it unsuitable for direct engagements, relegating it to reconnaissance roles. The Panzer II, with a 20mm autocannon and improved armor, also ended up playing a secondary role, as its armament proved ineffective against most Allied tanks. The Panzer III, on the other hand, was the true workhorse of Afrika Korps. Designed for tank-to-tank combat, it was initially armed with a 37mm gun, although in Africa it was upgraded with a 50mm version, Aus FG, more effective against the lighter British tanks. However, it still had difficulty penetrating the armor of heavier models such as the Matilda and Grant. The Panzer IV, in its D, E and F1 versions, was equipped with a short 75mm gun, effective against fortified positions, but insufficient against enemy armor. Only with the arrival of the F2 variant, equipped with a long 75mm gun, did Rommel's forces have a tank capable of facing the heaviest Allied vehicles on equal terms. This version of the Panzer IV Ausf F2 introduced for the first time a truly competitive anti-tank capability against Allied models such as the Grant or Sherman, which would begin to arrive in greater numbers from 1942 onwards. The improved long-range armor-piercing capability transformed the nature of desert combat, allowing the Germans to maintain a relevant armored force even in the face of growing Allied industrial power. Rommel's 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions employed other armored vehicles and anti-tank weapons. Units, such as Rommel's Kampfstaffel Incorporated, captured British tanks, such as the Crusader Mark VI, and made very effective use of anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, particularly the dreaded 88mm gun, which proved to be one of the most lethal weapons in the desert. The combination of innovative tactics and bold use of armored units allowed the Afrika Korps made significant advances in North Africa. However, the Desert War was not just a battle of tanks and maneuvers. The ability to sustain the offensive increasingly depended on logistics and control of key ports. With Tobruk still in enemy hands and the British preparing a counter-offensive, the balance of power remained uncertain. Desert conditions. The Sahara Desert and its surrounding regions offered arid and hostile terrain. During the day, temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, exposing soldiers to heat exhaustion and dehydration. The stifling heat made water supplies a critical resource, often strictly rationed. At night, however, temperatures could drop to near freezing, forcing soldiers to wear additional clothing to protect themselves from the cold. Another constant danger was sandstorms, which could last from a few hours to several days. These storms reduced visibility to near zero, clogged weapons and engines with fine particles, and made breathing difficult. Troops often covered themselves with cloths and protective goggles, but they still suffered eye irritation and respiratory problems. The lack of clear landmarks in the desert complicated navigation. Without roads or nearby towns, units relied on maps, compasses, and later, rudimentary aerial navigation systems. Even experienced leaders, such as General Irvin Raml, became lost in the desert's vastness, confusing locations and trajectories. The sandy terrain made vehicle movement difficult, especially in dune areas. Tanks and trucks could get stuck in the sand, and fuel consumption was much higher than in other regions due to traction difficulties. This situation forced both sides to develop specific tactics, favoring the use of light, four-wheel drive vehicles such as the British LR-DG long-range desert group and captured German vehicles, more adapted to the desert. Resource shortages forced both forces to rely on long supply lines, making convoys prime targets for airstrikes and ambushes. The Germans and Italians in particular faced severe logistical problems due to the distance between Europe and North Africa, which limited the supply of fuel, ammunition, and food. These difficulties reflected a war that, beyond tactical maneuvers, depended heavily on logistical capability. The African campaign was, according to military historians, the ultimate logistics war. The side that managed to maintain a constant flow of supplies dominated the pace of operations. In this sense, the vulnerability of Axis convoys, subjected to British naval and air harassment, limited German offensive capabilities even when the terrain seemed favorable. Combat in the desert was intense but often brief. During periods of inactivity, soldiers faced other problems: boredom, water shortages, and disease. Pests were a constant nuisance. Flies, rats, and fleas infested the camps, favoring the spread of diseases such as dysentery. Hygiene was a luxury in an environment where water was scarce and had to be reserved primarily for drinking. Showering or washing clothes was nearly impossible, contributing to skin infections and other illnesses. Soldiers sometimes collected condensation from vehicle radiators, despite its unpleasant taste and the risk of contamination. Uniforms were modified to suit desert conditions. The British wore lightweight, light-colored, short-sleeved garments, while the Germans adopted tropical uniforms inspired by Italian designs. On many occasions, soldiers wore captured enemy clothing, either for comfort or necessity. Food rations varied significantly between sides. The British received rations consisting of biscuits, canned meat, tea, and some sugar, allowing them to maintain a basic but repetitive diet. The Germans, on the other hand, tended to rely on smaller and less varied rations, especially when their supply lines were disrupted. The Italians, despite logistical problems, often had better rations, including wine, pasta, and spirits, which sometimes generated envy among their German allies. In desperate situations, troops were forced to improvise with whatever they could find, from hunting small animals to reusing enemy food. The battle begins, Operation Crusader. When Rommel launched his first desert offensive in March 1941, his forces advanced rapidly across Cyrenaica, pushing the British back to the Egyptian border. However, Tobruk's garrison, composed mainly of Australian and British troops, dug in and held firm. The fortified city boasted a port essential for supplying Allied troops, allowing it to hold even as the rest of the region fell under Axis control. Rommel attempted several times to take Tobruk by direct assault, but a combination of well-prepared defenses, accurate artillery fire, and a lack of sufficient logistical support for a sustained offensive frustrated his attempts. Rommel's failure to capture Tobruk did not go unnoticed in Berlin. While the world press celebrated his bold advance, criticism began to emerge within the German High Command. General Franz Halder, chief of the Heer General Staff, viewed the conduct of the campaign with skepticism and felt that Rommel was operating without a clear strategic plan. From his perspective, the German general had led the Afrika Korps faced an untenable situation. Its supply line was extremely vulnerable, and it was too far from its bases in Tripoli, making it impossible to sustain a prolonged war of movement without first securing a solid logistical center. Without a decisive victory and without the means to exploit its initial successes, the Axis advance stalled in the desert. Meanwhile, the British took advantage of the months of relative inactivity to reorganize their forces. During the summer of 1941, the Eighth Army was reinforced with new units and modern weapons, while Rommel was forced to operate with limited resources, dependent on long supply routes from Italy and under constant threat from the Royal Navy and RAF. As the siege of Tobruk dragged on throughout 1941, political pressure on British Prime Minister Winston Churchill intensified both in Parliament and within the military high command. The failure to free the entrenched, mostly Australian, garrison was seen as a symbol of stagnation and a lack of initiative by the British Empire in the face of the African Push Corps. The city, transformed into an isolated and heroic bastion, became a recurring theme in Westminster debates and in the press, which called for an immediate offensive to break the siege. For Churchill, Tobruk not only had strategic value as a logistics port, but also immense symbolic weight. It represented British tenacity in the face of Hitler's war machine. This situation led Churchill himself to directly intervene in operational decisions, pressuring the commanders in Cairo to launch an offensive to regain the initiative in North Africa. Operation Crusader was not just a military maneuver, it was also a political response to domestic criticism and skepticism from the Allies, especially the Americans, about Britain's ability to sustain the war effort. Success or failure at Tobruk could have implications beyond the desert. It would affect Commonwealth morale, domestic support for the British government, and the global perception of who was in control of the war. By November 1941, the British were ready to launch a major counter-offensive, Operation Crusader. The British offensive begins. General Auchinleck had reorganized the troops that would take part in Operation Crusader within the 8th Army, commanded by General Sir Alan Cunningham, who was fresh from winning victories over the Italians in Abyssinia. At the start of the Crusader battles, the 8th Army was deployed as follows. At Tobruk, the 70th Division under Major General Scobie, who also commanded the entire garrison, the Polish 1st Carpathian Infantry Brigade under Major General Kopansky, and the 32nd Army Armoured Brigade under Brigadier Willison. On the right flank, the 13th Army Corps under Lieutenant General Godwin Austin, composed of the New Zealand Division, Major General Freiberg, the 4th Indian Division, Major General Messervy, and the 1st Army Armoured Brigade, Brigadier Watkins. On the left flank, YTX Army Corps under Lieutenant General Norrie, consisting of the 7th Armoured Division, Major General Gott, the 4th Armoured Brigade, Brigadier Gatehouse, the 1st South African Division, Major General Brink, and the 22nd Guards Brigade, Brigadier Marriott. This formation was fully motorized with an armoured force spearheaded by the 7th Armoured Division, which had 469 tanks, including 210 Crusader and 165 American-made M3 Stuart tanks. Since the British still used tanks to support infantry, both the Tobruk garrison and 33rd Corps had a number of Cruiser and Matilda II tanks. In total, the 8th Army could field 713 gun-armed tanks, with another 200 in reserve. At that moment, the Panzergruppe Afrika, theoretically under the command of General Bastico, was deployed as follows. The Italian 20th Mobile Corps, under the command of General Gambara, composed of the Armoured Division Ariete, General Ballotta, and the Motorized Division Trieste, General Piazzoni. The Panzergruppe Afrika, commanded by Lieutenant General Rommel, was composed of the Afrika Korps under Lieutenant General Cruvel, with the 15th Panzer Division, Major General Neumann Silkow, the 21st Panzer Division, Major General von Ravenstein, the Afrika Division, Major General Zimmermann, and the Savona Division, General de Giorgis. In addition, the Italian 21st Corps under General Navarini was composed of the Brescia Division, General Zambon, the Trento Division, General de Stefanis, the Bologna Division, General Gloria, and the Pavia Division, General Franceschini. The Panzergruppe Afrika had been formed on 15th August, which allowed Rommel to appoint General Cruel as commander of Afrika Korps. The original 5th Light Division was renamed the 21st Panzer Division, although in essence it remained the same unit. The newly formed Afrika Division was composed of 2 infantry battalions recruited from former German volunteers of the French Foreign Legion. In early December, this unit was renamed the 90th Light Division. Rommel's plan was to use the Italian 21st Corps to take Tobruk, while the Afrika Korps, along with some German units and the entire Savona Division, would face the British on the line Sidi Omar, Capuzzo, Halfaya Solom. The 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions were ordered to position themselves near Gambut and be ready to move in any direction when required. Gambara's Ariete Armoured Division was located at Bir el Gubi, while the Trieste Motorized Division was deployed at Bir Hacheim. Facing Cunningham's 713 tanks, the Germans could only field 174 panzers, along with 146 Italian tanks. Crusader offensive began on 18 November amid a torrential rainstorm, with one British corps taking up positions to cover the Halfaya Pass. The other corps advanced across the desert in 3 columns, with the center column heading towards Tobruk to link up with a planned sortie of the garrison troops. This part of the attack advanced successfully, managing to approach to within 16 kilometers of the port and capturing the airfield at Sidi. However, the 22nd Armored Brigade on the left flank encountered strong resistance from the Ariete Armored Division, losing at least 50 of its newly arrived Crusader tanks. For its part, the 4th Armored Brigade on the right flank ran directly into the 21st Panzer Division and was stopped in its tracks. At Bir el Gubi, the Ariete Division, protected by an extensive minefield and well-positioned anti-tank artillery, successfully resisted the attack of the 22nd Armored Brigade. In this battle, the forces were fairly evenly balanced, as the Italians had 146 EM-1340 medium tanks and supporting artillery, while the British deployed 158 Crusader tanks supported by a 25-pounder artillery battery. However, within their artillery screen and anti-tank defense, the Italians had 7 truck-mounted 102mm coastal artillery pieces, firing armor-piercing shells originally designed to penetrate naval armor. These pieces proved devastating against the British tanks, inflicting heavy casualties on the 3rd and 4th County of London Yeomanry regiments as they attempted to outflank the Italian position. Although initially taken by surprise, Rommel soon realized that the British plan was to reach the Tobruk garrison. On 22 November, he ordered his 2 Afrika Panzer divisions to corps counterattack to recapture Sidi, supported by the Italian 21st Corps. The battle for this airfield saw numerous tanks on both sides destroyed, but eventually the site was back in German hands. Norrie's 7th Armoured Brigade was reduced to just 10 operational tanks. The 22nd Armoured Brigade withdrew with just 34 tanks remaining, and the following day the 5th South African Brigade suffered the loss of 3,400 of its 5,700 men. At the start of the Crusader attack, a gap of 32 kilometers had emerged between the 13th Corps and Norrie's 30th Corps. To cover this opening, the 4th Armoured Brigade, with its 165 M3 Stuarts, was detached from the 7th Armoured Division, reducing its strength by a third. This allowed Rommel to engage them separately, a tactic he executed with great effectiveness and satisfaction. The first indication of the British assault was a report of some 200 tanks advancing from the southwest. General Ludwig Cruel repeatedly warned the Panzergruppe about this intrusion and insisted that it posed a serious threat. However, Rommel simply wasn't convinced that this was more than a harassing operation. He was determined to attack Tobruk and had no intention of delaying the offensive again. Puzzled by Rommel's lack of response to his advance, Norrie had sent his 7th Armoured Division to take Sidi and its 22nd Brigade to challenge the Ariete Armoured Division. Meanwhile, the 4th Armoured Brigade remained in Gabersele to protect his left flank. His plan was to force Rommel to commit his armoured force, but in the process he broke his spearhead and weakened Cunningham's original plan, which sought to draw Rommel into a tank battle against a concentrated XEX Corps. With this, the numerical advantage was lost. The Italians lost at least 34 tanks, but the British eventually withdrew from the engagement, leaving behind 50 disabled tanks. By this time, Cruel had finally convinced Rommel that the British attack was serious. Rommel responded by sending an attack force consisting of 120 tanks from the 5th Panzer Regiment, under the command of Colonel Stefan, towards Gabersele to confront the enemy threatening the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. By mid-afternoon, Stefan's force had made contact with the 4th Armoured Brigade northeast of Gabersele and opened fire at 1,500 yards. The British were equipped with the new Honey M3 Stuart light tanks, which could move at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour, and charged into the ranks of the 5th Panzer Regiment, creating utter mayhem. However, the Honey only mounted a 37mm gun, forcing its crews to close to within 1,000 yards for their fire to be effective. Interestingly, the name Honey came from the first British tank commander to test one. After a quick desert trial, he returned, exclaiming, "That's a real Honey!" Honey, and the name stuck. Much of the fighting was fought at very close range, with disastrous results for those who exposed their flanks to enemy fire. By nightfall, Stefan's force had inflicted serious damage on 2 regiments of the 4th Armoured Brigade and withdrew to resupply. However, the overall situation was confusing, and that same evening Rommel received reports that a British force of tanks and armoured vehicles had broken into the airfield at Cidres and had captured it from a weakened Italian garrison. Aerial reconnaissance also reported 3 long British columns moving north between Girabub and Bir el Gubi. In response, Major General von Ravenstein proposed combining the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions to destroy each British column one by one. However, he misinterpreted the direction of the British spearhead and spent much of the day cruising around Cidomar in search of an imaginary enemy. When he finally realized his mistake, he turned the 15th Panzer in a broad movement to the southwest, and on the afternoon of the 20th of November, the 8th Panzer Regiment encountered a strong enemy armoured force supported by artillery and anti-tank guns. The enemy turned out to be the 4th Armoured Brigade, stationed in Gabra Saleh, and a fierce tank battle ensued. As night fell, the British withdrew and the 15th Panzer was established in Bagra Lukum to resupply. Meanwhile, the severely damaged 4th Armoured Brigade found it had only 77 Honey tanks left, and the total number of operational tanks in British X Corps had been reduced to just 119 of various types. Meanwhile, the 7th Armoured Brigade and the New Zealand Division reinforced their positions around Sidi Rezeg and repulsed the Afrika Division's attempts to retake the area. Realizing the threat this posed to his perimeter around Tobruk, Rommel decided to attack north from Gabr Saleh to intercept and destroy the enemy force advancing on Tobruk. Several important opportunities had been wasted the day before, but on November 21st, the Afrika Korps launched an all-out attack, preceded by 88mm and 50mm anti-tank guns against Sidi Rezeg. By midday, the 7th Armoured Brigade was virtually wiped out, with only 10 cruiser tanks managing to escape. The Germans had opened fire from 2,000 yards behind a screen of anti-tank guns, and soon after, the 15th Panzer positioned itself on the high ground overlooking the airfield. However, attempts to capture the airfield itself failed. Tobruk garrison, under General Scobie, attempted their planned breakout offensive, and Rommel was forced to hold them off. To link up with the garrison, the 7th Support Brigadier Jock Campbell's group advanced north with the intention of capturing the Sidi escarpment Rezeg, and from there open a corridor to Scobie's forces. The British 70th Division, together with the 32nd Army Tank Brigade, hit the Afrika and Bologna divisions hard, forcing Rommel to commit all his reserves to close the gap in his lines around Tobruk. Meanwhile, the 13th Corps, led by the New Zealand Division, advanced behind the Afrika Korps, crossing the Trik Capuzzo near Sidi Azis. This situation forced Rommel to order the withdrawal of the Panzertruppe headquarters at Gambut towards El Adem during the night of 21st November. With no reserves available to stop this new threat, Rommel resigned himself to sending 2 reconnaissance battalions to the east to monitor the movements of the 13th Corps. Crusader offensive had devolved into a chaotic mess of scattered engagements, with German and British units spread out over an area of over 40 kilometers of desert. The mobility of approximately 35,000 vehicles of all types had pulverized the terrain into a fine sand that billowed in the wind, mixing with gun smoke and burning vehicles until visibility became virtually zero. Units wandered aimlessly, advanced in circles, and unexpectedly collided with each other for hours, leaving their commanders with no clear view of the outcome of the battle or the location of their own forces. On the afternoon of 22nd November, the New Zealand Division was deployed between Sidi Azis and Menastir, with their right flank covered by the 5th Infantry Brigade and their left flank protected by the 6th Brigade. Scouting units reported the presence of enemy forces to the south and west, but the full extent of the threat was not fully understood until the following morning. At dawn, on the 23rd of November, the 15th Panzer Division, having reorganized its forces during the night, advanced northeast with the aim of encircling the New Zealand Division. Shortly afterwards, the 21st Panzer Division attacked from the southwest. Between them, they succeeded in encircling the New Zealand Division, trapping the 4th and 6th Infantry Brigades along with the 5th Indian Infantry Brigade, which had been sent as reinforcements. The New Zealand troops, surprised by the speed and force of the attack, attempted to organize a defense in depth. 2-pounder anti-tank guns were deployed in strategic positions, and mortars began firing to slow the panzer advance. However, German artillery responded with accurate fire, destroying many of these defensive positions before they could make a significant impact. During the first hours of the battle, German motorized columns infiltrated the New Zealand positions, dividing their forces into small, isolated groups. Lines of communication were disrupted, and confusion gripped the battlefield. The New Zealand 4th Infantry Brigade attempted a tactical withdrawal eastward, but encountered intense machine gun and 88mm gunfire, which devastated its ranks. By midday, the situation had become desperate. The 6th Infantry Brigade managed to establish a defensive line around Menastir, but its supplies of ammunition and water began to run out rapidly. Attempts to receive air support failed due to the dense cloud of dust and smoke covering the battlefield. Meanwhile, Rommel, observing the battle from his command post on a nearby hill, ordered the attacks to continue until the New Zealanders completely surrendered. As pressure mounted, the 5th Indian Brigade attempted a counterattack, but was repulsed by superior German armor. As night fell, thousands of New Zealand soldiers began to surrender in small groups. Although some units managed to escape eastward, the majority of the New Zealand division was captured or destroyed. Rommel, satisfied with the victory, decided to consolidate his forces before launching the next attack against the British 13th Corps. The Battle of Cidres was a clear example of the aggressive and bold leadership style that characterized the Afrika Korps. Despite being outnumbered, Rommel's forces managed to concentrate quickly and launch localized counterattacks that disrupted the British plans. The German ability to exploit gaps and exposed flanks, combined with the synchronized use of 88mm anti-tank guns, allowed them to neutralize entire brigades of the 8th Army, even when their supply lines were stretched to their limits. As night fell on November 23rd, the situation for the New Zealand division became untenable. Without supplies, with communications cut off and surrounded by superior armored forces, the New Zealanders were forced to make a difficult decision: continue the fight without hope of reinforcements or surrender to avoid total annihilation. Some units attempted to break through in small groups, moving stealthily between the German lines. However, many of these escape columns were intercepted by Afrika motorized patrols, Corps who used searchlights and flares to detect movement in the darkness. Only a few soldiers managed to reach the British lines, while most were captured or eliminated in night skirmishes. By dawn on the 24th of November, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions had completed clearing the battlefield. Over 6,000 New Zealand and Indian 5th Infantry Brigade soldiers were taken prisoner. Among them was Major General Bernhard Freyberg, who, despite initial resistance, chose to surrender to avoid further unnecessary casualties. Freyberg's capture ordered that he be treated with respect and granted him the opportunity to send a message to his British superiors, informing them of the surrender. This gesture was not only an act of military chivalry, but also a strategic move to weaken British morale in the campaign. With the New Zealand division neutralized, Rommel turned his attention to the British 13th Corps, which was still holding positions in the eastern part of the battlefield. However, a lack of fuel and ammunition began to affect the Afrika's mobility. Corps. The German High Command in Berlin, although impressed by the victory, was unable to provide the necessary supplies due to constant interference by British aircraft with supply routes. Fuel shortages forced the Afrika Korps to reduce the speed of their operations. The panzers, which until then had held the initiative, began to become immobilized, waiting for resupply. Rommel, aware of the fragility of his position, ordered the lines to be consolidated and the defenses reinforced in case of a British counterattack. Meanwhile, the British 13th Corps, although weakened by the loss of the New Zealand division, still posed a significant threat. The British took advantage of the operational lull in Afrika Korps to regroup and launch a counterattack towards Sidi Rezeg and El Adem. The Royal Air Force intensified its raids on German positions, attacking supply columns and troop concentrations with constant bombardment. On the battlefield, British troops advanced with the support of the 4th Armoured Brigade, which still had a considerable force of Crusader tanks. These vehicles, although inferior in direct combat to the Panzer III and IV, attempted to wear down the Germans through repeated attacks, forcing them to consume their already scarce supplies of ammunition and fuel. Rommel, facing increasing pressure, decided to withdraw part of his forces to safer positions. Rather than risk a prolonged battle in a disadvantaged position, he opted to regroup west of Tobruk, using the desert terrain to hamper the British advance. German withdrawal and strategic situation. On 26 November, troops of the British 13th Corps managed to advance to the outskirts of Sidi, where they encountered fierce resistance from entrenched German and Italian troops. The fighting became more static, with artillery exchanges and localized attacks as both sides attempted to reorganize. The German withdrawal was carried out with great discipline. Rommel, with his characteristic leadership at the front, personally supervised his troop movements. Despite the losses suffered, Afrika Korps still maintained its cohesion as an effective fighting force. However, the accumulated wear and tear in the Battle of Sidi had significant repercussions for the Axis. The failure to secure a decisive victory and increasing British pressure meant that Rommel was unable to consolidate a solid offensive position. The British Eighth Army, although weakened, still had the capacity to continue the fight. On the other hand, the capture of thousands of Allied soldiers and the destruction of important British units demonstrated Rommel's tactical effectiveness. However, as in other African Corps campaigns, lack of supplies prevented this tactical victory from being translated into a lasting strategic victory. Despite Rommel's tactical successes at Sidi and the heavy casualties inflicted on the British forces, the British Eighth Army, commanded by General Claude Auchinleck, managed to maintain pressure on Afrika Korps. With German supply lines stretched to the limit and British aircraft constantly pounding Axis convoys, Rommel was forced to gradually withdraw from the Egyptian border to the west. On 7 December 1941, Rommel ordered the abandonment of the defensive line at Tobruk, allowing British forces to finally break the siege of the city. However, instead of withdrawing directly to Tripoli, Rommel established new defensive positions on the Gazala line, about 50 kilometers west of Tobruk. For the British, things were not all rosy. Lack of fuel and supplies, limited air support, and the continued reinforcements arriving at Auchinleck from Alexandria led Rommel to decide on a tactical withdrawal, despite Italian insistence on holding out. The Italian Field Marshal Count Cavaliero even flew from Rome to the theatre of operations to try to convince Rommel, on Ciano's personal request, to hold firm in Cyrenaica. However, the situation for the German forces defending Sollum and Halfaya was unsustainable. Without food or water, they had to begin a massive retreat in the face of the superior British. Leaving behind small garrisons, the bulk of their forces retreated nonetheless. The German light divisions, in danger of being surrounded, were supported by panzer forces in their attempt to break out of the encirclement, which they achieved on December 6th. Auchinleck, from his headquarters at Maddalena, telegraphs Churchill to inform him that Rommel is in full retreat to the west. Panzer divisions and the Ariete to the west, withdrawing in order to a defensive line that he drew at Ain el-Ghazala and later at El Agheila. But Rommel withdrew without ceasing to fight with the British, who harassed him while eliminating the last pockets of resistance, mainly Italian. Cruel insisted that Rommel stop the pressure exerted by the British, convinced that they could even be forced to retreat to the border if the Italian divisions that were still fully operational, the Ariete and the Trieste, were used. But his commander, General Gaston Gambara, asserted that his troops were no longer capable of combat. With a phrase that became famous in the Desert War, especially among German troops, Cruel repeatedly broadcast a single message to Rommel: "Erwin, where is Gambara?" However, many Italian units surrounded by the British defended themselves ferociously to the last bullet. Little known, for example, is the exploits of the Carabinieri Reali group under the command of Major Edoardo Alessi, parachuted on December 19th over the settlement of Elouet El Assel, south of Bardia, to protect the withdrawal of Afrika Korps. 400 men fought against superior British troops and material. When the Italo-German forces retreated safely from British pursuit, the survivors withdrew, leaving 3 platoons of 40 men under the command of Lieutenants Molo, Solito, and Grippo to cover their rear. Isolated and unable to cross hundreds of kilometers of territory already in British hands, The 26 survivors held out in a nearby Arab village until February 6th, when the Afrika Korps offensive retook Cyrenaica, overwhelming the British defenders. During the first phase of the retreat, under attack from British aircraft, the German panzers suffered a serious setback due to their lack of supplies. The blockage of the tanks without fuel at Bir el Gobi prevented a withdrawal to El Agheila, and Rommel lost his Major General Walter Neumann Silkau of the 15th Panzer Division, who died fighting in his tank on the same day, the 6th, on the outskirts of El Gobi. He was not the first high-ranking officer that Rommel lost. As mentioned above, General von Rauvenstein had been taken prisoner on November 29th. Between December 28th and 30th, Rommel pulled back all his available troops and armoured vehicles to the final defence line at El Agheila. From there he would only move in February to reconquer Cyrenaica and once again overwhelm the English defences. Although fighting across the border of the Cyrenaica region continued during the month of January, the battle for the liberation of Tobruk was considered over on December 30th, as the fronts stabilised and Auchinleck failed to achieve his main objective, to destroy the bulk of the Afrika Korps encircling it around Tobruk. The last German defenders of Sollum and the Halfaya Pass, short of supplies and exhausted of ammunition, succumbed on the 12th and 19th of January respectively. A month later, Rommel returned and crushed the British Eighth Army in the next major battle of 1942. From February to May 1942, both sides resupplied and prepared for the next major confrontation. The Battle of Gazala, fought in May-June 1942, would become one of Rommel's greatest victories, allowing him to capture Tobruk and advance into Egypt.